Thank you and welcome. As Sean said, it's wonderful to have you here tonight. Before we plunge in, I was wondering if I could get a bit of a show of hands. Who here has read The Abolition of Man before? Okay. A handful. I think that was about what I was expecting. So it's good to know who I'm speaking to. I probably will spend a bit over half my lecture tonight just giving an overview of the argument of the book. And so for some of you who have read it, this will be a refresher. And I hope that it will also tie together the various threads of the argument for you, because it is a surprisingly complex argument. It's a pretty short book, but when I've taught it in the past, as Sean mentioned, I have taught it over the course of 3 2-hour classes. Now, we obviously don't have that kind of time tonight, don't worry. So there is a lot that could be pulled from it. And if you're new to the book, then I suggest that you think of tonight as a taster and hopefully a preparation for reading it. We're just not going to have time to unpack all of Lewis's claims, some of which I think at first acquaintance can be pretty astonishing. But if there are points that you would like me to elaborate on a bit more, we are going to set aside a few minutes for Q&A at the end, so hold on to those thoughts and we can come back to them. You can also come chat to me afterwards, or even get a copy of the book and let Lewis explain for himself. So let's get into it. With a little context to the book, first of all, Lewis originally wrote it as a series of 3 public lectures, which he delivered at the University of Durham in 1943. What was going on in 1943? Well, World War II is still raging, so Lewis is speaking to a society that's in crisis mode. And he speaks of a crisis, but the problems and the warnings, the problems he identifies and the warnings that he gives, they're not really about threats that are over the English Channel. They're very much at home. The warnings are often quite domestic. Yes, these threats can manifest in political regimes, but also, according to Lewis, in English textbooks, and in our attitude to our ancestors, and in contraceptive use. The threat is a threat to our human nature. And of course, that touches on every aspect of life. So those 3 lectures in the book form, it's still divided up into 3 parts. And we can sort of see these 3 parts as organised around 3 distinct enemies that Lewis identifies. These are the debunkers in part 1, the innovators in part 2, and the conditioners in part 3. And as we go through and discuss what these are, I think we'll recognise these spectres as still present in our own day. But we should also recognise that we're living, more than 80 years downstream from when Lewis gave these lectures. And to the extent that his warnings were right, to that extent, then we're now in the position of having to unwind damage that has already been done. And even, I think, to consider how we ourselves might have become like these 3 spectres. And that's where we're going to be finishing up at the end of this evening with discussing that question. But before we get there, we'll go through the argument of the book. So part 1 is titled Men Without Chests. And I will come back to why he calls it that. Lewis's point of departure in the book is a recently published English textbook designed for upper secondary school. He doesn't name the textbook or its authors. He just refers to it as the Green Book. And the authors, he's not really trying to target them as people. They're more kind of symbolic targets for his polemic. They are the ones who represent the debunkers in part 1. But it is interesting to note, I only learnt this actually fairly recently, that the authors of the Green Book that Lewis is discussing in The Abolition of Man were actually professors at Australian universities. So you may well wonder how their approach to education might have shaped affairs in our own country, and there is a letter that Lewis wrote to one of his correspondents where he has some rather snide remarks about Australians, I think, on the back of this textbook. Anyway, you can ask me about that in Q&A if you like. So let's go back to the Green Book. In the Green Book, the authors are trying to arm their students against propaganda. They're trying to prepare them to withstand language which is designed to provoke certain sentiments in readers, to provoke certain emotional responses, and thereby to manipulate them. And in the context of war, you can see why this would have felt essential to education. But of course, that concern didn't end with the World Wars, and it really is still a major preoccupation of the English curriculum in Australia now as well. So how do the authors go about this? Well, they actually make a pretty startling philosophical claim. They claim that when a speaker makes a statement about value, and the example that is discussed is a statement, "This waterfall is sublime," right? That such a statement is just expressing the speaker's feelings and says nothing about the facts of the matter. So what the authors claim is that what the speaker really means when he says, "This waterfall is sublime," is, "I have sublime feelings while looking at this waterfall." They're not saying anything about the waterfall at all. So that's the claim the authors make, and Lewis has 3 criticisms of this. Firstly, they're writing an English textbook. They purport to be teaching about the English language, but the only characteristic of good language that they identify is that good language is factual. And unsurprisingly, Lewis, as an author of fiction, thinks there's probably a bit more to language than that. The second criticism he makes is just that their underlying philosophical claim is fallacious. It just doesn't work. And thirdly, he says that when the authors say that statements about value are merely about feelings and nothing more, what they're doing is they're improperly dividing the sentiments from reason and from reality. They're saying that feelings have nothing to do with reason and nothing to do with reality. So against this, Lewis makes this claim. He claims that our feelings about good and bad, beautiful and ugly, noble and base, that these can in themselves be right or wrong. When we have these feelings, we could be right in having them, or we could be wrong in having them. And he also argues, which is where we start to hit upon the theme of the book, that these feelings are actually what makes us human. They distinguish us from what is wholly spiritual on the one hand and wholly animal on the other. So where does this leave the author's aim of protecting their students against propaganda? Because it's a good aim, right? We don't want to be suckers to propaganda. Well, in debunking values, Lewis thinks that the debunkers will not even achieve their own goal. Instead of producing students who are ruled by reason, which is what the debunkers think that they're doing, their mode of education will produce, here is Lewis's expression, men without chests. It will produce men without chests. Lewis is there giving an analogy of the human person, which he's drawing loosely from Plato. So the analogy is that man is constituted by a head, which is reason, which rules the belly, which are our animal appetites and desires, by means of the chest. So the head, reason, rules the belly, our appetites, by means of the chest. So the chest is the seat of the sentiments, or we might say of our loves. And in the mature person, our feelings are not distanced from our reason, but they are, to quote Lewis, organised by trained habit into stable sentiments. So a mature person has his feelings trained and in order so that he feels the right things on the right occasions. The well-formed chest delights in the goodness of a thing, which is in fact good, and despises the crude, the dishonourable, the base. We don't want to just delight in the dishonourable and despise the good. We want to delight in the good and despise the dishonourable. But the debunkers relegate values to the realm of merely subjective emotion. For them, there's no right and wrong in this realm. There just are feelings. There might be pleasant feelings, painful feelings, but there's not much more that we could say about them, according to the debunkers. But in doing this, in relegating values in that way, the debunkers are evacuating the chest. And therefore, they also evacuate reason of its motive power. If we do not train students' chests in the love of good things, how can we expect them to grow up into mature adults who direct their actions towards good things? We should not be surprised, Lewis argues, if after neglecting to hold out the goodness of courageous acts to young minds, we find that they grow up to be cowards. If you never learn to love and admire courage, you won't end up neutral, you'll just end up a coward. We should also not be surprised if, after sending students through an education system which holds out no good thing to them except that good grades will get them into a good degree, will get them into a good job, we find that they care for little apart from comfort and security and the approval of others. Because what is there in the way that we educate that might suggest they could aspire to anything else? So that's part one. Lewis faces off against the debunkers who want to say that values about good and bad, beautiful and ugly, etc., that these are merely subjective. And he argues that the consequence of this mode of education is actually a dehumanisation of the students. They never get an opportunity to develop their chests. So let's go on to part two. Part two is titled The Tao. And in this section, Lewis moves away from just a critical stance to making his positive case for the existence of the values, these values upon which our sentiments are to be trained. Why, after all, to take Lewis's example, should we suppose that courage is good? Why should we want students to be trained to love courage? So in this section, Lewis's opponents are called the innovators. And they believe that a good deal of what people have traditionally held to be valuable can just be expunged. And instead, we can refound morality on a more rational basis. I can't unfortunately cover the whole argument from this chapter tonight. It's very much worth reading and understanding in full, but I'm just going to draw out two important points from it. The first point is this. In this chapter, Lewis he's not defending an ethical system so much as an ethical inheritance. It's not a system that can be constructed or even discovered through reason. Instead, it has to be received. So, for example, Lewis takes the idea that it's good to sacrifice oneself for one's country or one's friends. And he says that this is not a conclusion that we come to through reasoning about it. Instead, its goodness is a universally acknowledged starting point for ethical reasoning. We first have to learn to see that self-sacrifice is good. We have to learn to feel its goodness in our chests. And only then will we be able to think through the implications for how we ought to live. So values are received, they're not discovered or constructed. That's the first point I want to make. The second point is that even though we must simply receive this ethical inheritance, we can't prove it through reason, these values still have to be learned. They don't just come to us through instinct. We can think about it as similar to language in this respect. Language has to be learned. It seems hardly possible for us to think without the use of language, and yet language is not something that we're born knowing, it's something we learn. And learning these values is like learning our native language. We cannot think, we cannot act without them. So for Lewis, if we neglect to pass on this inheritance of values, we're neglecting something just as fundamental to education as is language itself. Lewis calls this inheritance of values the Tao. So that's spelt T-A-O, pronounced Tao. It's a Chinese word, and that signals that he's not arguing for the preservation of some set of specifically Christian values or even Western ones. Lewis actually argues for the Tao on the basis of its being shared across cultural divides. He finds it in Confucianism, in Buddhism, in ancient paganism, as much as in the Old and New Testament scriptures. The Tao functions similarly to the way that the natural law does in ancient Greek and Roman ethical traditions, and then later in the Christian ethical traditions. But I think that if Lewis had called it the natural law, he would have obscured its universality. And he also would have introduced confusion into his argument in part 3, because as we'll soon see in part 3, a certain definition of the natural is about to be very important to the argument of the book. So to summarise part 2, Lewis argues for a universal inheritance of values. It's common to all human beings. It's received, it's not discovered, and we need to be taught it. It must be actively passed on. It is the native language of human ethics, which we must learn in order to be able to think and act as mature human beings. Part 3. So this one is where the book gets its title. This is The Abolition of Man. In part 3, Lewis conducts a reductio ad absurdum. So this is a style of argument in which you show that a position is foolish by following it all the way to its absurd conclusion, the ad absurdum. Lewis starts off by saying that the opponents of part 1 and 2, the debunkers and the innovators, they were rather inconsistent in their rejection of the Tao. Lewis argues that they still end up relying upon an inheritance of values as the basis of their project. They all still believe that there are some universal values. They're just mistaken, first of all, about how those values are transmitted, and secondly, in thinking that they could reject some while accepting others. But now Lewis asks, what happens if the Tao is rejected fully and consistently? So in part 3, we meet a new enemy, the conditioners, who are the ones who set out to do just that. They are more self-aware and logically consistent than the debunkers and the innovators are. They see the Tao as just one more constraint of nature, which man will overcome. So let me read you a quote in which Lewis speaks in their voice. So this is the conditioners speaking. You say that we shall have no values at all if we step outside the Tao. Very well. We shall probably find that we can get on quite comfortably without them. Let us regard all ideas of what we ought to do simply as an interesting psychological survival. Let us step right out of all of that and start doing what we like. Let us decide for ourselves what man is to be and make him into that. Not on any ground of imagined value, but because we want him to be such. Having mastered our environment, let us now master ourselves and choose our own destiny. This is the turning point in the abolition of man. What began as a fairly narrow argument about ethics and education becomes a diagnosis of an underlying rot in the whole techno-scientific project of modernity, and a warning about where this project might be taking us. Lewis's claims in part 3 are these. First, that the rejection of the Tao is of one piece with the techno-scientific project of conquering nature. Hear that line again. Having mastered our environment, let us now master ourselves. If we can learn to control every other aspect of nature, can't we learn to condition our own psychology? So that's the first point, that rejecting the Tao is part of modernity's techno-scientific project. Second point, that what we call man's conquest of nature always takes the form of some men exercising power over other men. It takes the form of some men exercising power over other men. Lewis gives a few examples to support this, but he particularly emphasises the effect of present technological changes on future generations. Those future generations don't get a say into what kind of world they are born into. That's a power that we hold over people of the future. We might also think of the way that some of the most world-altering innovations of the last century, such as the nuclear bomb, artificial intelligence, that these seem forced upon us by technological arms races. They arise in the context of man's desire to dominate others and his fear of being dominated. So that's Lewis's second point, that man's conquest of nature amounts to the conquest of some men over other men. His third point, that when this conquest extends to altering man's own nature, right, which is what the conditioners were starting to talk about doing, when it extends to man's own nature, the domination of some men by other men is complete. Some men, the conditioners, will seek to choose what other men will feel to be valuable. And to be able to choose that for another is to have complete command of the other's intellect, will, and actions. So in extending the conquest to man's own nature, the domination of some men by others is complete. Fourth point. Yet, and this is where we come to the absurd conclusion. In altering man's nature by stepping outside the Tao, man reduces himself to being driven by nothing but his own desires. He reduces himself to being driven by his own desires. We neglect the chest, the Tao, and when we do this, the head, reason, ceases to have any governing authority. We become mere belly, or we might say mere beast. We become driven by our own desires. Fifth and final point. Thus, in the end, nature conquers man, Lewis thinks. The conquest of nature resolves in nature conquering man. Even those men who would set themselves up as the conditioners, as those who are masters of other men, they are themselves mastered because they are ruled by the tyranny of their own uncontrolled desires. And so nature conquers man. We'll dig into that last point a bit more. What does it mean for nature to win? Lewis has been invoking this term nature from at least the end of chapter 2, when he begins speaking of man's conquest of nature. He doesn't actually define it until quite late in chapter 3. And as Lewis uses the term, nature, it's not what we might think of as like the world untouched by humans. For Lewis, the concept of nature is very much a human construct. It's the world stripped down to its bare atoms and biological processes. Nature is really easiest to define in terms of what it's not. It's opposed to the human, the civilized, the spiritual, the supernatural. Nature is not any of those things. Nature lacks qualities or consciousness or purpose of its own. And because it has none of these things, nature seems to us to be available for conquest. We take things which have no inherent purpose of their own, and we bend them to our own purposes. We give them purpose. If nature were to have qualities like consciousness or autonomy, we would see that to conquer it would actually mean enslaving it. And it's because human beings have their own purposes and reasons that they are not mere tools for the use of other human beings. When we treat other people like tools, we enslave them. So Lewis suggests that our conquest of nature takes the form of enslavement. By stripping the world around us of its own qualities and purposes, we fail to consider that nature could lay any claim over us. We reduce it to nothing but a tool for our use. And then when we apply that reduction to man himself, to our own human nature, enslavement is not a mere metaphor anymore. When we see other men as mere material for manipulation, for psychological conditioning, we are quite straightforwardly making them into slaves. And Lewis thinks that this spirit of domination has actually pervaded modern techno-culture from its very beginning. However, he does say that this last step is not like the others. This last step of applying the conquest of nature to our own human nature is something different, and qualitatively different happening there. Rendering man merely natural, which means no longer under the Tao, this results in nature's victory. The man that emerges from this conditioning is man in his merely bestial nature, governed by appetites. And this is true not only of the conditioned, of those who are subject to the tyranny of others' desires, it's also true of the conditioners. The conditioners are subjected to the tyranny of their own souls. And as Christians, we know that such internal tyranny is indeed dreadful. So that, briefly, is the argument. And you might be thinking, if you're new to the Abolition of Man, that we've come a pretty long way from a few complaints about modern education. So let's circle back there now and see how we've gotten there. The Abolition of Man is not an expressly Christian book, in the sense that it doesn't take for granted any specifically Christian assumptions. But Lewis's view of the Christian life, I do think, very much undergirds it. For Lewis, the Christian life is a pilgrimage to becoming more human. This is the meaning of Christian discipleship. It's becoming more like the truest man that was and is Jesus Christ. If you're interested more on Lewis's thought on this, then I would refer you to his spiritual autobiography, Surprised by Joy, and his account of the Christian life in Mere Christianity. If you've read Mere Christianity, that account of the Christian life will sound familiar to you. So with that in the background, one way to understand education is in this broad sense of discipleship. And this is the solid kernel in that cliche about educating lifelong learners, right? Taken in this sense, education is a lifelong endeavour. And at the same time, it's also appropriate to see it as focused more narrowly on the period from infancy through childhood to adulthood, because the boy growing up comes into the fullness of who he is as he enters mature manhood. I think we can draw two implications for the book from this understanding of education. The first is that if the absurd conclusion of modern techno-culture is really the abolition of man himself, we can expect its damaging work to focus on childhood, when we are educating immature human beings into whatever we think a mature human being is. Secondly, although the Abolition of Man is not, as I've said, is not expressly Christian in any of its arguments or assumptions, it is a book that ought to be of critical concern to Christians who see discipleship as the shape of the whole human life. For these reasons, then, The Abolition of Man is fundamentally a book about education and a book about Christian discipleship in the modern world. Much of what Lewis warns of is not in our immediate control. So, the AI arms race isn't in the hands of Christians in Armidale, of course. Yet there are still some questions I think we can be directing to ourselves, each in our own small domain. So I'm going to finish with 3 questions for us to be thinking about. First, do we accept the logic of conditioning? Do we accept the logic of conditioning? The conditioners believe that the right techniques can mould the human population to their desires. And it's possible to take this same approach to our churches, our families, and ourselves. I think it will ever be a temptation to us to apply a regimen of tools and programs and technologies, all with very good intentions, very often, and overlook the reduction that we are performing on ourselves in the process. The more moderate point that we can at least grant from Lewis's rather dire warnings is that our technologies are never just neutral tools that are governed perfectly by our intentions. They're never just neutral and governed by our intentions. Even the very fact that we are using them means something, irrespective of how they are used. A second question. Are we like the innovators? Do we believe that we can pick and choose the bits of the Tao we like and reject the others? I think that a sign that we do not tend toward this mistake would be that we take very seriously our ethical tradition. So we must remember that the Tao is an inheritance, and the heir is a child in his father's house before he is the owner of the house. We must be in the position of humble recipients before we can be masters. If we are to reach maturity, we must accept that even our generation, even in the 21st century, even we must entrust ourselves to and be disciplined by those who went before us. And this is quite important to actively recall, because the most ingrained posture of modern people towards preceding generations is one of criticism and self-superiority. We're very used to thinking of ourselves as those who have mastered through innovation. And it's very difficult for us to willingly subject ourselves as understudies to masters of the past. Then applying this to formal education, we must remember that a great part of what we should want to be cultivating in children is humility. And this, of course, is a principal Christian virtue. It's also part of the Tao. And as part of the Tao, Lewis saw it as in accord with long-established wisdom regarding education. For both Plato and Aristotle, youth needed to be subjected to training in desiring what is good before they are fit for reasoning about what is good. No philosophy until they are 30, suggested Plato. I'm not 30 yet. I wonder what Plato would think. And indeed, throughout Plato's dialogues, we see cases of people for whom a grasp of logic and argument serves just to malform their souls. They twist it to serve their own desires rather than to move towards the truth. That's a theme that we see coming up for Plato again and again. And unfortunately, this sort of humility is about the opposite of what much of our school curriculum aims at. I think this point is, as it was for Lewis, I think it's still in our day quite obvious in the study of English, in which children are taught to use words to make a reader think and feel whatever they want her to feel, without worrying about whether what they're arguing for is true and good. This is something I'm gleaning from observation from tutoring English across the school years. I won't go into it now, but can expand on it later if you like. But I think the problem extends beyond the English classes, and even beyond the more obvious instances of ideological capture that we might see in the so-called humanities. I've sometimes considered whether we shouldn't teach modern science to children. And only half seriously, physics was my favourite subject in school. But I do think the modern sciences share in that danger that Plato and Aristotle recognised in philosophy. They present the world to us as subjected to our masterful knowledge and subjected to our powers of manipulation before we've first learned to wonder at it, to delight in it, to respect it, and thus to learn from it. A third question. Are we like the debunkers? Are we neglecting the training of our sentiments? A good measuring stick for how well our sentiments have been trained within the Tao is our gut response to various Tao rejecting innovations. Is there alignment between what we Christians are required on paper to say is good and what we actually feel to be good and noble? A few examples to think about. Do we apprehend that a world in which AI, or just machines for that matter, eradicates the need for most kinds of work, that would be a terrible world for human beings? Do we know this not just because we read the creation mandate in our Bibles, but because we have felt the pleasure of good work? Or do we only experience work as a necessary evil? Necessary perhaps to feed our faces, to pay pastors and missionaries, or for the recreation that we enjoy on weekends or in retirement. Another example. Do we view cases of children preferring chatbots to human teachers or human friends, or adults preferring them to human spouses? Do we view these cases as vastly tragic? And do we know this not just because we've read somewhere that it is not good for man to be alone, but because we are in awe of the ordinary wonders of human-to-human encounter? An encounter which could never be reduced to fulfilling a list of psychological needs, which a bot might be able to do quite well. And then, to take an example which is so passé now that we've almost forgotten how we're supposed to feel about it, do we find homosexual desire to be, as the Apostle Paul called it, a vile affection? What ought we to feel about something that is called contrary to nature in the scriptures? If we're not sure, then I would suggest that we lost the battle against same-sex marriage long before 2017. We lost it whenever we ceased to feel opposition to it in our chests. If our society has any hope of staying human, it must come from Christians reclaiming the Tao. Without well-trained chests, we will not have it in ourselves put up any resistance. Have you tried to put off a sin that you don't hate? Part of putting it off is learning to hate it. And in the same way, if we wish to be good, we must learn to love the good first. Thank you.